My group's decade was the 1950s. Entertainment in the 1950s was very developing, and it was just now starting, like everything was starting to be produced and get developed. And so some of the top music in the 1950s were Johnny B. Good by Chuck Berry, Hound Dog by Elvis Presley, Great Balls of Fire by Jerry Lee Lewis, Tutti Frutti by Little Richard, Smokestack Lightning by Howlin' Wolf, Summertime Blues by Eddie Cochran, You Send Me, Sam Cooke, Money Honey, The Drifters, Your Cheatin' Heart, Hank Williams, and Peggy Sue by Buddy Holly. Elvis Presley was a very, very influential person in the 1950s. He was really famous for his rock and roll music, and he was just a really popular figure in the entertainment industry. The movies in the 1950s were also starting to develop. Some of the top movies back then were 12 Angry Men, Singing in the Rain, House of Wax, Rear Window, Vertigo, The Seven Samurai, A Streetcar Named Desire, Some Like It Hot, North by Northwest, and Peter Pan, which was one of the first Walt Disney movies ever created. TV in the 1950s, just like the music and movies, was also beginning to just sprout up. Some of the television shows that people watched in the 1950s were I Love Lucy, which is still on today, Gunsmoke, which still is on today, they play reruns, The Ed Sullivan Show, Leave It to Beaver, Bonanza, The Twilight Zone, The Jack Benny Program, Perry Mason, Have Gun, Will Travel, and The Today Show. And The Today Show actually had a monkey on their television set. His name was J. Fred Muggs, and he was basically like the mascot for their television show from 1953 until 1975, which I thought was pretty cool. He had like a friend too on the show. I'm not really sure what his name was, but I thought that was cool. The sports in the 1950s, baseball was really, really, really popular. I think it was probably the most, besides like football, in the 1950s that the people watched and went to and stuff like that. Moving into fashion and popular culture trends, most dresses that the women wore were pleated, or which are like folded and gathered. Right there you can see that. Not a lot of women like wore pants back then. They always wore dresses and skirts. They always like dressed up and looked really good all the time. Most of the dresses that the women wore had large bows at their waistlines. Popular prints were plaid, which is right here. Prints like polka dots, floral, stripes. Wide collars and puffy shoulders were still popular, but not together, not in the same outfit. More luxurious fabrics were being preferred, like satin, silk, lace. Shades and tints of red and pink were also really popular. Pink was a super popular color in the 1950s. Gloves began coming back into style, and tight bodices were worn in almost every item of clothing that women wore. Flowing and fitted skirts, all of the skirts were either really, really tight or really, really loose. The hourglass shape was very, very desired in this decade, especially after Marilyn Monroe. All of the women wanted to have this hourglass shape and have this sort of figure. They wore foundation garments to achieve this, which basically like squeezed your stomach so it would look like you were skinnier. Sheath dresses also became really popular. That's this right here. They came in a lot of different patterns and different styles. They came in short sleeves, long sleeve, tank tops, stuff like that. The daytime dress that women wore usually stopped around their knees, and the evening dress was often long and flowing. Men's fashion was a little bit different, but they did have some similarities. The cardigan sweater was very popular, especially among athletes. Plaid was also a very popular color. A lot of men did wear plaid. The cowboy look was popular for a short amount of time, but it eventually died off. That's this right here. They would wear jeans and like a belt with a belt buckle and a button up that had more of like a western feel. It died off really quick. It wasn't really popular for that long. Even the men wore a lot of pink in the 50s. Pink was a really popular color back then. Jackets and trousers were shorter than they had usually been. Ties became slimmer and shirt collars were less out there and noticeable. They weren't that big anymore. Men started to wear a lot of Hawaiian patterns during like their leisure times and leisure activities, like on the weekends, and polo shirts started to become popular in the 1950s too. And in the 50s, a lot of men wore hats. Like they never went anywhere without wearing a hat. Like they wouldn't leave the house without a hat on their head. Girls' fashion was just about the same as women's, except it was ranged from more of a child look, so a little bit younger. Girls wore poodle skirts, which is this right here. It was a flowy pleated skirt that most of the time had a poodle on it, but sometimes it could have cats, instruments, musical notes, anything like that. And they wore bobby socks, which are socks that had like, you would crunch them up at the bottom instead of pulling them all the way up. And they would wear those with their saddle shoes, and most girls back then wore ponytails. The boys wore gabardine suits, and gabardine is a tough, tightly woven fabric, and the reason they wore these was so they wouldn't mess up their clothes when they were playing, because it's like a tough fabric, it's not going to mess up, and boys can be rough sometimes. Corduroy bibs for the baby, suspender longies for playing, which is like it was like a jumpsuit, and it was made out of really soft fabric so they wouldn't get bothered or like annoyed when they were playing and messing around. The coat sweater, and most of the teenage boys wore work outfits made of rugged army twill. Okay, the top most important events in the U.S. during the 1950s. In February of 1950, the first credit card was made, and since today everything revolves around money, I guess that was a good thing. In June of 1950, I think on June 25th, the Korean War began. Here's some pictures from that. And it lasted about 3 years. It ended on July 27th, 1953. On January 20th, 1953, President Harry S. Truman died. In February of 1953, DNA chemical structure is found, which is probably a really good thing, because without that, we wouldn't have the science and technology and medical care that we have today. On May 17th, 1954, was the Brown v. Board of Education trials. On July 17th, 1955, Disneyland opened. There's a picture from that right here. It was actually pretty cool. I watched a video of the opening on YouTube, and it was really cool to see all those people. On December 1st, 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott began. And in the 50s, a lot of like civil rights was just now starting to become bigger and more of like a thing in the 50s, which leads into the next event. On September 9th, 1957, Eisenhower signed the first law into Civil Rights Act. So it was just like another step into the civil rights movement, which helped them a lot. On July 29th, 1958, NASA was founded, and they helped us with, back then, the space race, but today, science and technology. On January 3rd, 1959, Alaska became the 49th state of the United States, and on August 21st, 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the United States. The top 10 most important events in world history during the 1950s. So all throughout the early 50s, people were living in fear of communism, and it was known as the Red Scare. This is a poster that probably would be hung up around anywhere, and it was called the Red Menace. That's what they had a nickname for the communist countries. And America, like everyone in America lived in fear of communists. Like they did not want it to happen. They were scared of it. In 1952, Japan regained its independence after signing a treaty. On January 21st, 1954, the U.S. launched the first ever nuclear-powered submarine, and it was called the Nautilus. On May 11th, 1955, the Warsaw Pact was signed, and that is a thing from it, like an emblem or a symbol. On November 1st, 1955, the Vietnam War began, and that war lasted like a really long time. I think it ended in 1975. Here are just pictures of men in combat in the airplanes. On November 22nd, 1955, the Soviet Union detonated its first hydrogen bomb, and hydrogen bombs are like really, really powerful. Like they're almost like, I think they're like as powerful as atomic bombs, which is not pretty good. In October of 1956, the Suez Crisis in Egypt, so their Suez Canal, it was, I think they were trying to like get it like independent again. On October 4th of 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. So then again, like back to NASA and the space race, this was like a huge leap for them. Sputnik was a satellite, and they sent it up into space. July 14th, 1958, Iraq's King Faisal II was assassinated by its own army. And in 1959, Fidel Castro established the first communist regime in the Western Hemisphere, and that was like a huge deal because the people were so like scared of communism, and they didn't want this like communist government coming in and taking over something that they didn't want it to spread. There was this thing called the domino theory, where if one nation falls to communism, they all do. And that's what they were really scared of. They didn't want that to happen. And then it happened. So, back to that, the Red Scare.